So at this point, I want to talk about the reasons we forget. So we start by discussing the misinformation effect. And one of the reasons we forget then is because we change our memories. We reconstruct them according to our expectations, or as in the case of the misinformation effect, we change them according to information we're given at the time of recall. So in this experiment by Loftus, she had subjects view a film of a car accident that occurred at an intersection with a stop sign. And then she gave misleading information telling them that the sign was a yield sign. And if you were one of the subjects in the study, do you think your memory would be based on what you actually saw or what you were told you had seen? And subjects who were given false information were much more likely to recall the correct traffic sign. So additionally, another experiment by Loftus where she had subjects view a film of a traffic accident and she asked them how fast the cars were going when they hit each other versus how fast they were going when they smashed into each other. And of course, subjects who were asked when they smashed into each other said they were going faster. So the information they were given in the question affected their recall. That's one example of how we construct our memories according to our expectations. In the memory experiments video about sleep, you saw the idea of memory construction as well, and how we can change what we actually remember, even add or construct information according to our expectations. And there's this controversy of whether or not we can forget because we've repressed information, because we've pushed it from our memory because of trauma. And some supporters suggest that yes, abuse happens and repression is a natural response to that. And however, skeptics suggest that while individuals aren't lying on purpose, they can be very easily led by therapists inadvertently creating those false memories. And countless studies show that it's easy to create those false memories. So one example that I think is particularly interesting is the idea of McMartin Preschool, which was preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, which happens to be where I'm from. And it was right across the street from the preschool that I attended, which was the Little Red Schoolhouse. And McMartin Preschool was accused of taking kids off-site to another location and committing terrible acts of sexual abuse with animals, etc. And they were accused of having had this go on for quite some time. So there was a lengthy trial, and eventually all of the accused individuals were acquitted, and this was all found to be the effect of poor interviewing techniques, that the kids had these memories implanted in them by suggestion of the interviewer. So since then, there have been stricter rules about that, but eyewitness testimony is tremendously unreliable because our memories are so susceptible to distortion and construction. Another reason that we forget is decay. So Ebbinghaus used nonsense syllables like the syllables here, and he actually studied himself. He was the subject of his own experiments. But, for example, he noted the forgetting curve, which here is over days of time. Notice, this is one of those study tips, notice that by tomorrow you'll have forgotten 75% of what you learned today. So it's always a great idea to fight that forgetting curve by reviewing the material the same day you learn it. And that way you can really improve your retention. So decay theory is a belief that memories gradually fade and deteriorate over time. And it really seems that what happens within the first 24 hours, we lose 75% of that, but then after that, it's much more stable. We see a similar curve if we stretch this out over years of time. We see greatest decay in the first 3 years, but after that, whatever we remember, we tend to remember forever. And remember also, because of memory consolidation, because after we sleep, memories move from unstable temporary storage in the hippocampus to all over the brain cortex for more stable and long-term storage, and that's that process of consolidation. Because that occurs over a 24-hour period when we sleep, if you spread out your studying, you're able to allow the memories to build on themselves in a more stable and reliable way. And so if you spread out your studying, you can actually spend less time studying and get more out of it. And that's the idea of distributed practice as opposed to mass practice, which is studying all at once. Another important reason we forget is interference. And to understand this concept, you want to use your hands for audience participation here. So they use the example of philosophy. We're going to put philosophy in your left hand. So actually put that there with your left hand. Put your hand out in front of you. You study that in the morning. And then a couple hours later, you study psychology. And the next day, you have a philosophy test. And however, the psychology that you've studied after the philosophy is going backwards and interfering with that philosophy. And so that's retroactive interference. When what you studied later, which in this case was psychology, is going backward and interfering with what you studied first. Whereas in proactive interference, if we still have it the same way, we have philosophy in our left hand, and put that in your left hand, put your hand out in front of you, and put your right hand psychology in your right hand. You studied psychology later, and you're trying to take your psychology test that you studied later, but the philosophy you studied first is coming forward and interfering, then that's proactive interference. So both of those are reasons that we forget. And of course, one way to reduce the effects of those is not to study both subjects on the same day, reduce that interference. But if you have to, you want to go to sleep right after you study the subject that you want to remember most, because going to sleep is the best way to reduce interference. So, and remember that serial position effect. If you study a bunch of stuff, you're going to be most likely, for example, if it's a list of items, you're going to be most likely to remember the items at the beginning and end of the list, particularly for immediate recall. Right after I ask you, I read you a list of items and then ask you to write them down right afterwards. We see the primacy effect. You remember the first items in the list, and the recency effect. You remember the last items in the list because you've just heard them. But if I wait an hour and ask you to write down what you just heard, we only see the primacy effect. We only see that you remember the first items in the list better than those in the middle, and that's because the recency effect no longer applies. It isn't recent anymore. So, and with retrieval theory, this is the idea that forgetting occurs because we just can't find the information we're looking for. And how can the retrieval process break down? You can't remember what you didn't encode. If you're not paying attention as you're trying to learn things because you're doing something else, you're not going to remember. A lack of retrieval cues. You didn't relate it to other things in your memory. You didn't build examples. Remember that self-reference effect. If you build an example that's relevant to you and yourself, you're going to get the best results out of that. We remember things that are relevant to ourselves. So having examples that are relevant to you in your life, those are particularly powerful retrieval cues. And then that tip of the tongue phenomenon. You know the information is in there, but you just can't find it. And one way to fight that is to organize the information as you put it in your brain. Remember to start with that hierarchy. So for example, this is a chapter about memory. And underneath that, we've had different topics that we've covered in the different videos. So the types or stages of memory, the types of information in memory is another topic. The content of long-term memory, the types or stages, the processes of memory, all of those things are places where you can file the information. And then in this video, reasons we forget. And remember, when we talk about not being able to remember what you didn't encode, you might not know which is the correct image of a painting because you'd have no reason to encode that information, so it's not in your long-term memory. So ineffective encoding, memories are never stored because of lack of attention. So, and then of course we talked about repression already. This is a controversial idea which could be adaptive, psychologically helpful to help you forget certain things that are painful or anxiety provoking, but it's a very empirically controversial topic.